It happened at 2:38 in the morning. While America slept, the House of Representatives stirred with something far more dangerous than silence: calculation. Behind closed doors, a bill was sliding toward a vote. A bill that would rip nearly $1 trillion out of Medicaid. In the name of budget reform, they said. But what they didn't say was who would bleed. Then she stood up. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Hair pulled back, eyes wide awake, and a voice like a blade. One by one, she named the truths they tried to bury. The billionaires they were protecting, the mothers they were sacrificing, and the women whose miscarriages wouldn't just break their hearts, but might now break their insurance coverage too. Republican men tried to interrupt her, shut her down, mock her for speaking to the camera. But she wasn't talking to them. She was talking to the 13.7 million Americans on the other side of that screen. And she didn't just debate, she obliterated. This is the story of one woman standing in the middle of the night, in the middle of a room full of power, and burning it all down with nothing but facts, fire, and fearlessness. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace, but from power doing something it hopes no one notices. The House chamber, normally bustling with footsteps, murmurs, and the occasional procedural gavel, was nearly empty. Just a few scattered bodies slouched in leather chairs, their ties loosened, their eyelids heavy. The overhead lights were dimmed, throwing long, deliberate shadows across the blue-carpeted floor, like secrets stretching their limbs across democracy itself. It was 2:38 in the morning, the hour when America sleeps, when headlines pause, and when most people assume nothing meaningful is happening in government. That's exactly why it was happening now. Somewhere near the back of the chamber, a group of Republican congressmen leaned in close, their voices hushed but tense. Papers shifted between their hands. Not a few sheets, but a stack nearly 416 pages thick. A bill, a dense, complex bill dressed in sterile legal language, with a gut punch buried deep inside. Nearly $1 trillion slashed from Medicaid. No press conference, no public debate, no daylight. Just three men whispering across red folders, nodding, pretending this wasn't a grenade with the pin already pulled. At the far end of the room, the door creaked open. No one turned. They didn't expect anyone important. But then she walked in. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't burst into the room. She didn't need to. She walked like someone who had run out of patience, but not out of fight. Her blazer was wrinkled, her shoes scuffed at the heel. 16 hours of hearings had left their mark on her appearance, but not on her eyes. Her eyes were sharp, defiant, and somehow awake. She paused for a second just past the threshold, scanning the room. The drowsy staffers, the scattered Republicans, the glow of the voting terminals. Then she saw the stack of papers. She knew. She always knew when something wasn't right. And this silence, this hour, this sudden push, it wasn't just off. It was deliberate. It was calculated. She moved down the aisle, her heels softly tapping against the floor like a metronome of rising tension. As she reached her seat, one of the aides shot her a look, not quite panic, but something close. "They're pushing the vote through," he whispered, quietly. "It's hidden on page 312. AOC didn't reply. She sat. She didn't fumble for talking points. She didn't reach for a coffee. She simply opened the bill, turned to page 312, and read. For 30 seconds, nothing moved but her eyes. And then, without looking up, she said the words that would anchor the night. "If you're passing this in the dead of night, maybe it's because you're ashamed of it." It wasn't shouted, it wasn't scripted, but it cut deeper than anything the room had heard in hours. A few heads turned. One man scoffed. The kind of scoff men reserve for women who won't stay quiet. But she was just getting started, because this wasn't just a bill. It was a betrayal, and she was going to make sure that even if it passed tonight, America would wake up knowing exactly what was done in its name. She stood, adjusted the mic, and leaned in. And somewhere across the country, a nurse on a double shift, a mother checking her daughter's fever, a retired vet with a pile of unpaid medical bills, they would all feel it. They didn't know it yet, but someone was about to speak for them. And the men in the shadows were about to realize, you can't hide policy in darkness. when someone walks in carrying fire. The sentence still hung in the air. If you're passing this in the dead of night, maybe it's because you're ashamed of it. And yet no one in the room seemed eager to respond. They shifted in their seats, pretended to check phones, adjusted ties, anything but look up. The silence wasn't absence. It was avoidance. Across the chamber, a few Democrats huddled near the side aisle. Their voices were low, cautious, not because they disagreed, but because they weren't sure just how deep this rabbit hole went. One congresswoman clutched a copy of the bill in both hands, flipping through pages with quick, nervous fingers. They tucked it in under administrative provisions. She muttered to the man beside her. Clause 14, Section 9. It reads like legal cotton candy. Sounds sweet, dissolves under pressure. Someone else added, no hearings, no amendments, no debate on the record. They're fast-tracking it while America sleeps. AOC didn't join the whispering. She didn't need to. She was reading, line by line, word by word. And then, halfway down the third column on page 314, her hand froze. There it was, the phrase able-bodied adult, listed as a condition for Medicaid eligibility, paired with the phrase mandatory work activity documentation. It was familiar language, vague enough to sound neutral, clinical even, but she had learned how dangerous that kind of phrasing could be. She had seen how the phrase able-bodied had been weaponized in state after state to kick disabled people off their coverage, to force gig workers into red tape mazes, to make unemployed synonymous with undeserving. But something else caught her eye, a section referencing exemptions for pregnancy and postpartum status. She read it twice, 3 times. No mention of miscarriage. Not a word. Her mind flashed to a town hall she'd held in Queens. A woman stood up, voice trembling, and shared how she had miscarried at 13 weeks. It was painful. It was terrifying. But it was made worse when she was kicked off Medicaid because her pregnancy was no longer active. That had been in a state-level system. Now it looked like that same cruelty was being built into federal policy, just in time to hurt thousands more. That was the moment something shifted in her. Not anger. That came later. This was something quieter, sharper. Resolve. She didn't ask for the mic. She didn't clear her throat. She just stood and reached for it. The mic clicked on. A low hum rolled through the speakers. Across the back of the chamber, a camera light flicked on. They always knew when she was about to speak. Staffers in the gallery leaned forward. Phones lifted into the air. The few reporters still in the building moved into position. She tapped the mic once, gently. Then she spoke, clearly, deliberately, like someone pulling a thread she already knew would unravel the whole fabric. Before we talk about numbers and thresholds and actuarial projections, I'd like someone to explain to me, in plain English, what happens to a woman who miscarries? Because I've read your bill, and I can't find her in it anywhere. She didn't blink, didn't fumble. She just stood there holding their silence like it was evidence. And the room, the entire room, stopped pretending not to hear. AOC didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calmness wasn't passivity. It was pressure building in a tight, controlled chamber. And when she spoke, the room listened. Not because it wanted to, but because it had to. I want to tell you about a woman named Mrs. Alvarez, she began, her voice steady, measured, but laced with something sharper underneath. She lives in the Bronx, 82 years old, a widow, has glaucoma in one eye, arthritis in both knees, and still takes 2 buses just to get to her doctor. She was on Medicaid until last fall. Some in the room had already shifted in their seats. A few glanced down at phones, annoyed but pretending to scroll something relevant. One Republican aide scribbled on a notepad, not because he needed to, but because he didn't want to look up. She lost her coverage, AOC continued, because she didn't file the correct paperwork proving that her part-time caregiving job had ended. She called the office 4 times. English isn't her first language. Her son tried to help, but by the time the letter came, the deadline had passed. She let the words hang. No drama, no tears. Just the facts, hard and cutting. Do you think that woman is the problem with our budget? No answer. Just the faint hum of the room, the rustle of fabric, the click of a pen cap, the shuffle of impatient posture. Somewhere in the back, a Republican congressman let out a long breath through his nose. That's how discomfort sounds when it doesn't want to become dialogue. AOC pressed on. Because I read this bill. It's 416 pages of policy, and somehow not a single sentence in it would have protected her. Not one sentence that would have made sure an elderly woman who's worked her whole life, who still rides the bus alone to pick up her prescriptions, would be treated with dignity. Not one. Then she looked up. Instead, you wrote new, work requirement compliance language. You put in reporting thresholds, verification mandates. You invented a maze and then told people without maps to find their own way through. And when they get lost, when they miss a deadline, or don't upload a document, or call the wrong number, you call it their fault. Now the room was still. Uncomfortably so. Not silent from ignorance, but from knowing exactly what she meant. Who are you saving with this bill? Her tone didn't rise, but her words quickened. Who is this supposed to help? It's not the poor. It's not the sick. It's not the mothers. It's not the elderly. And it's definitely not Mrs. Alvarez. From the Republican benches came a faint but unmistakable sound. The click of a pen against wood. Then another. A shift in a leather seat. And a sigh, the kind meant to be heard. The kind that says, here she goes again. The kind that turns from policy to posture when the facts start getting too close. But AOC didn't pause. She turned slightly toward them. Not confrontational, just direct. If you're going to use personal responsibility as the excuse to strip healthcare from millions, then at least have the decency to explain where they're supposed to go. Don't hand them a locked door and pretend it's a bridge. She placed the bill down on the podium, hands flat. Her voice still hadn't risen, but the air around her had shifted. A fuse had been lit, and everyone in the room, whether they admitted it or not, could already smell the smoke. She didn't ask for permission to keep going. She didn't need it. The room might have been growing restless, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez knew exactly what she was building toward, and she wasn't about to let up just as the spotlight was finally where it needed to be. Her hand tapped the stack of papers again. This bill is 416 pages long, and somewhere between the work requirement clauses and the exemption loopholes, there's a quiet little adjustment, one that has nothing to do with Medicaid eligibility or efficiency or fraud prevention. She looked up slowly, pausing just long enough to let a few members glance her way again. What it does change is how much tax a billionaire's children pay when they inherit a mansion. No one interrupted, not yet. But the tension changed. It shifted from disinterest to discomfort. They were listening now, even if they didn't want to. You see, she continued, her tone still level, but tightening, in 2017, under the Trump administration, the estate tax exemption was increased. Back then, if someone inherited a house worth $11 million, they paid no federal tax on it. Zero. Nada. And now in this bill, this so-called Medicaid reform, there's language to quietly extend that exemption, all the way to $22 million. A low murmur moved across the chamber. One Republican aide scribbled something and passed a folded note across two chairs. Another congressman crossed his arms and leaned back, letting out a short, performative exhale. AOC didn't flinch. They want you to believe this is about balancing the budget, that we're cutting Medicaid because it's just too expensive, because America can't afford to take care of its sick, or its elderly, or its disabled. But that's not the truth, not even close. She stepped slightly to the side, letting her hand rest on the back of a chair beside her. Let me tell you the truth, since no one else seems interested in doing that tonight. They aren't slashing Medicaid to save your money. They're doing it to protect theirs. The sentence hit the room like a dropped glass. Subtle, but sharp. Everyone heard it. Most didn't want to acknowledge it. But the truth was too clear to ignore. She kept going. There are people in this country, millions of them, who are losing sleep wondering how they'll afford a doctor's visit, how they'll refill a prescription, how they'll get insulin for their kid, and at the very same time, there are people inheriting $22 million homes who now get to keep every last penny of it, tax-free. Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes burned. So let's not pretend this is about trimming fat. Let's not dress up cruelty in a suit and call it economics. This is a transfer of wealth, from the poor to the rich, from the vulnerable to the powerful. It's not fiscal policy. It's theft in formal language. A few murmurs of agreement began to rise from the Democratic benches. Behind her, someone nodded quietly. But AOC didn't turn for approval. She wasn't speaking for applause. She was speaking for the people who couldn't be in that room. The ones who would feel this bill not in theory, but in their bones. They are protecting the heirs of empire, she said, her voice firm now, and sacrificing the people holding this country together with unpaid labor, minimum wage checks, and caregiving jobs that don't come with benefits. Then she looked out again, not at the chamber, but through the lens of the C-SPAN camera now locked on her face. If that sounds like a system you never voted for, it's because you didn't. It was built in rooms like this, at hours like this. And just like that, the $22 million lie was no longer buried on page 314. It was front and center, exposed, named, and no one, not even those hiding behind procedure, could pretend they hadn't heard it. No sooner had AOC finished her sentence than the energy in the room shifted. She could feel it, the tightening posture, the exchanged glances, the way a few of the men on the other side of the aisle adjusted their jackets or cleared their throats. Not because they had something meaningful to add, but because they couldn't stand that someone had just said out loud what they had hoped would remain buried in bureaucratic fog. And then the interruption came. "We'd appreciate," a voice rang out from the Republican bench, dry and clipped, "if the lady would stop talking to the camera and start addressing the committee." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They were delivered with that particular brand of professional condescension, the kind that wears a suit, smiles politely, and expects you to sit down quietly once you've been corrected. A few heads nodded in unison, like loyal dogs trained to signal disapproval. A pair of Republican aides looked down to hide a smirk. AOC didn't move. She turned her head slowly toward the man who had spoken, and then let her eyes sweep the row behind him. Not one of them met her gaze. She leaned forward slightly, still calm, still composed, and responded in a tone as even as it was unshakable. "I'm speaking," she said, "to the 13.7 million Americans who are about to lose their Medicaid coverage. I'm speaking to the woman in Kentucky who works a night shift and won't qualify under your new work requirement. I'm speaking to the disabled veteran in Texas who's going to get kicked off because his paperwork got delayed. And I'm speaking to every single person watching this who's smart enough to know exactly what you're doing." Then with deliberate clarity, and no, I will not yield to disrespect. It wasn't just a reply. It was a boundary being drawn with words right there on the floor of Congress. A line of dignity in a room where dehumanization too often gets dressed up as debate. From the front of the chamber, the committee chair, a man who had been silently shifting in his seat for the past 15 minutes, finally decided it was time to act. He reached for the gavel and gave it a single, firm tap. Then another. It was the kind of sound that said more about appearances than authority. "The gentle lady will direct her comments to the chair," he said in the tone of someone trying to sound neutral but failing to hide his irritation. "Let's maintain decorum." But AOC wasn't moved by the tapping or the tone. She had been through too many of these. She knew what decorum meant in rooms like this. It meant be quiet, especially if you're young, especially if you're a woman, especially if your truth is making people uncomfortable. She continued anyway. "Do you know what people care about more than decorum? Healthcare, dignity, the right not to die because a form was lost in the mail. And if that makes some of my colleagues uncomfortable, maybe they should take a look at why." A cough echoed from one of the Republican seats. Performative, rehearsed. But the eyes looking away weren't from disinterest now. They were from something else. Discomfort, maybe even shame. And still, none of them answered her question. Not about the $22 million estate tax break. Not about Mrs. Alvarez. Not about the silent erasure of miscarriage from the policy text. They just looked away, as if looking away made it all disappear. But the camera didn't look away, and neither did she. She stood at the center of it all, barely 5.5 feet tall, framed by rows of mostly empty seats, and stiff backs that had turned ever so slightly away. She wasn't holding any paper now. The bill lay flat behind her, untouched since she'd read its ugliest truths aloud. And for a moment, it looked like she was standing alone. But the silence didn't make her smaller. It made her louder. There was a familiar ache in her chest, an ache she'd felt once before, on her very first night in this very chamber. That night, she'd walked into Congress wearing a white suit, hopeful, determined, and undeniably new. She had felt every eye on her, curious glances wrapped in polite smiles, concealed laughter exchanged over shoulders, whispers that didn't bother to wait until she was out of earshot. Bartender girl, the Bronx kid, she'll grow out of this fire. They hadn't welcomed her that night. They had tolerated her, and only because they thought they wouldn't have to do it for long. But tonight was different. Tonight she was still alone, but not for the same reasons. Not because she didn't belong, but because she had said the one thing no one else would. She had dragged their buried motives into the light. And now the room was doing what rooms like this always do when truth arrives uninvited. It backed away. She looked around and saw it clearly. The rows of dark suits, the carefully folded hands, the faces too proud to flinch and too arrogant to answer. And yet, none of it made her retreat. If anything, it confirmed she was exactly where she needed to be. Because for every man in that room who looked away, there were millions of people who didn't have the luxury. People who couldn't look away from the eviction notices on their doors, from the empty bottles of medication, from the state letters that said denied in sterile, bureaucratic font. She wasn't here to make this room comfortable. She was here to remind it who it had forgotten. AOC adjusted the microphone again, not because she needed to speak louder, but because the silence had given her the floor, and she intended to use every inch of it. She didn't need allies in that moment. She didn't need nods or approval or backroom reassurances. What she needed, what she had, was clarity. That what she was saying mattered, that someone had to say it, that it was better to stand alone in truth than to sit comfortably in denial. She had come to Congress knowing this day would arrive, the day she'd speak and the room would grow cold, the day they'd roll their eyes and whisper under their breath and try to turn her words into noise. But they couldn't drown her out, not tonight, because tonight she wasn't just a woman in the room. She was the only one telling the truth inside it. The room hadn't moved in minutes. The air was still, thick with the tension of a chamber that had been cracked open by too much truth. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wasn't done, not even close. She took a step forward, her voice steady, her tone cool, and asked the kind of question that has no easy place in sanitized policy debates. "Is miscarriage," she began slowly, "covered under your exemption clause?" She wasn't looking at the Republican benches now. She was speaking directly to the counsel sitting near the chair, one of the few people in the room whose job was to know the answer. The man adjusted his glasses, shuffled a few papers in front of him, and replied, "Postpartum coverage is listed in the exemption language. Yes." "That's not what I asked," AOC replied, unmoved. "I asked if miscarriage is explicitly covered under this bill." There was a pause, just long enough to register discomfort. Then he answered more carefully this time. "Miscarriage is not explicitly named, Congresswoman, but it could be interpreted as part of postpartum care, depending on state-level implementation." "Could be." Her voice had the weight of a hammer wrapped in silk. "So we're leaving the question of whether a woman recovering from a miscarriage gets to keep her health care up to interpretation?" Again, silence. The kind that says everything. She turned to the chair. "Let the record show that the council has confirmed miscarriage is not named in the text. Not once. Not even in a footnote." A few members stirred uncomfortably. One adjusted his microphone. Another scratched something pointless into a notepad. But no one spoke. So she asked again, "Why is miscarriage missing? Was that an oversight? Or is it because no one who drafted this bill thought it was necessary?" No one answered. And then she said the thing that cracked whatever illusion of professionalism they were clinging to. "Let me ask the men in this room, have you ever witnessed a miscarriage?" The question landed with a dull, merciless thud. Heads turned. A few grimaced. One member visibly shook his head, as if to dismiss the entire premise. She didn't wait for a response. Do you know what it does to a woman's body, to her mind, to her finances? And you're telling me this legislation demands proof of work activity, but doesn't even mention that reality? Now the discomfort turned to frustration. She could see it in their eyes, the quiet murmurs, the not-so-subtle sighs, the tapping of fingers, not because they disagreed with her, but because she had taken their tidy, abstract policy language and dragged it into the real world, where women bleed and cry and wake up in emergency rooms, and where coverage isn't a chart, it's a lifeline. She turned to the council one last time. Can you say under this bill that a woman who has just miscarried will retain her Medicaid eligibility without qualification, without delay, without paperwork she has to explain through tears? The man looked down. No, Congresswoman, I can't say that. AOC let the moment sit. The silence this time wasn't just avoidance. It was complicity. She exhaled, then spoke again, but now to the whole room, not just one man. Miscarriage is not a loophole. It's not a line on a spreadsheet. It is a devastating, traumatic medical event, and your bill treats it like it doesn't exist. And with that, she closed the folder in front of her. The facts had been laid bare. The question had been asked 3 times. And the truth? The truth didn't need to yell. It had already pierced the room. The answer had been given. The bill didn't explicitly protect women recovering from miscarriage, and still not one man in the room showed a flicker of alarm. Not one voice rose from the Republican benches to amend, to clarify, or to apologize. They just sat there, stone-faced, silent, and somehow satisfied that what they had written was sufficient. But AOC was not finished. Not when the stakes were this high. Not when the ignorance was this loud. She looked directly at the row of men who had chosen inaction as their political position and asked, "How dare you legislate women's bodies when you don't even know how they work?" It wasn't rhetorical. It was anatomical. It was political. It was personal. You want to police our choices, write bills about our wombs, pass laws about our care, but you couldn't even include the word miscarriage in the one piece of legislation that decides whether or not a grieving woman keeps her health coverage. Do you have any idea what that says to us? She didn't wait for an answer. She didn't expect one. Instead, she moved forward, straight into the heart of what they had been trying to pretend wasn't connected. You passed Dobbs. You celebrated when Roe was overturned. You smiled on camera while saying you were giving power back to the states. But you didn't stay for what happened next. You didn't stay for the woman in Tennessee forced to carry a non-viable fetus to term. You didn't stay for the teenager in Missouri told she couldn't leave the state for an abortion. And you didn't stay for the woman in Mississippi who miscarried and then lost her Medicaid because her pregnancy status had changed. That was when a voice cut in. Not a rebuttal, a dismissal. "This isn't relevant," said a man across the aisle, waving a hand like he was brushing away smoke. AOC turned her head and locked eyes with him. "To whom?" she asked, quiet but cutting. "Not to you, but to half this country. It's everything." The room fell still again, but this time the stillness felt fragile. She had named something raw, something too real to stuff back into policy language. And in doing so, she had exposed what this moment was truly about. Not numbers, not budget caps, not administrative compliance. It was about power and who was allowed to wield it without understanding what it means to live without it. She turned back toward the committee and spoke as if she were speaking directly to the country. This isn't abstract. This is not a theoretical policy note in some economics journal. This is a woman bleeding in a bathroom, calling a hotline, and getting voicemail. This is a mother being told that her grief doesn't qualify as postpartum. This is a law written by people who have never felt the weight of a pregnancy test, never had to hide in a break room because of a panic attack, never had to wonder if their insurance would outlast their own body. Then she stepped back, letting the silence fill the space once more. It was no longer a question of whether the bill was flawed. It was now a question of whether those defending it were willing to face the truth of what they'd done. And from the looks on their faces, that answer was becoming more obvious by the second. By now, the discomfort was undeniable. Even the stone-faced had shifted in their seats. The facts were too clear. The omissions too damning. But instead of admitting to the cruelty embedded in the policy, the Republican bench leaned on an old trick. Deflection dressed as semantics. "We're not cutting people off," one congressman said, raising his voice just enough to interrupt but not enough to be fully accountable. "We're shifting them to other programs, to better paths, to self-sufficiency." AOC raised one eyebrow. She didn't laugh, though the absurdity begged for it. She had heard this language before, this soft, sanitized kind of cruelty. It was the vocabulary of indifference, a velvet glove over an iron fist. She turned back toward the mic, calm but piercing. "Shifting?" she repeated. "If you shift a drowning man from a boat to the ocean, you didn't rescue him. You killed him." The room froze. It was only 10 words, but they landed with the force of 100. The kind of line that didn't need explanation. The kind that stopped pens mid-scribble and made even the committee staffers glance up from their screens. "Stop pretending this is policy innovation," she continued, each word crisp, deliberate. "It's abandonment. You are not offering people an alternative. You are handing them bureaucracy in place of care, red tape in place of shelter, and then walking away like your job is done." A few Republicans leaned back, arms crossed, brows furrowed in mock offense. One muttered something under his breath. But they weren't in control of the room anymore. Not really. The camera was still rolling. The live stream hadn't stopped once. And out beyond the walls of the chamber, thousands were already watching. On Twitter, a clip of her drowning metaphor had just been posted with the caption, "She said it, and she meant every word." On TikTok, users were stitching her speech with headlines about postpartum denials and Medicaid drop-offs. On YouTube, the stream's live chat was moving so fast it was unreadable, filled with fire emojis, words like "truth," "finally," and "this is leadership." AOC didn't flinch. She wasn't performing. She was connecting, and it showed. "They keep saying this is about accountability," she continued, motioning toward the stack of bill pages again. "But who are you holding accountable? The mother working 2 jobs? The elderly man who missed a document deadline? Or the billionaire who just inherited a tax-free $22 million estate?" She let the question sit. They call it a shift. But what it really is a quiet gaslight, a way to make struggling people feel like they failed a test no one ever taught them how to take. Another murmur spread. The truth had been spoken plainly, and once again the room had no rebuttal, only reactions. Because that's what gaslighting relies on. Confusion, doubt, manipulated language. But what they didn't count on tonight was someone stepping up to name it in real time. Someone who refused to let policy hide behind PR. Someone who refused to let shift mean anything but what it truly was, a cover word for cruelty. And just like that, the noise they tried to disguise as leadership had been drowned out by one voice, clear, sharp, and heard by millions. She had barely opened her mouth again before the interruption started. This time they came quicker, more coordinated, like a script rehearsed behind closed doors. One congressman cut in to clarify a point. Another jumped in to correct the record. A third muttered something about decorum, while not so subtly shaking his head. It was a tactic as old as politics itself. Talk over the woman who dares to speak too clearly, too confidently, and too inconveniently. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't raise her voice to compete. She didn't need to. She waited, let the interruptions pile up like clutter, and then leaned into her mic with the calm of someone who had seen this tactic too many times before. "Reclaiming my time," she said, enunciating each word like it was a boundary drawn in steel. The room went quiet, not out of respect, but out of calculation. She had used the phrase that gave her the floor back, and now they had no procedural choice but to give it. "Reclaiming my time," she repeated, "because I didn't come here to be corrected for speaking facts. I came here to speak for the people whose stories you keep trying to erase." She paused, then shifted her tone. Softer now, but no less steady. "In Texas, there's a woman named LaTanya," she began. "She works at a grocery store, part-time, because they won't give her full-time hours. She clocks in just under the threshold your new rules demand. And because of that, she lost her Medicaid coverage. A shuffle of papers from the Republican side. More discomfort. More silence. She didn't lie, AOC continued. She didn't cheat. She didn't miss an appointment or fail to submit a form. She just didn't work enough hours at a job that refuses to let her. And now her asthma medication costs more than her weekly paycheck. She paused and let the weight settle. So when you talk about work requirements, understand this. She is working. She is standing for 8 hours, restocking shelves, answering customers who don't wear masks, and going home with aching feet and a short check. She's not trying to cheat the system. She's trying to survive it. Another hand shot up to object, but she raised hers quicker. Reclaiming my time, she said again, firmer now, because if you can write a 416-page bill that mentions tax exemptions for the wealthy but can't protect a woman like LaTonya, then maybe you're not interested in fairness at all. She glanced around the room. No one met her gaze. She doesn't need to work more, AOC said, her voice low but resonant. She needs to live. She needs to breathe without skipping a dose. She needs to go to bed without wondering if tomorrow's shift will be enough to qualify for medicine. The Republicans had gone quiet again, not because they agreed, but because they knew they had nothing to counter it with. Nothing that would sound better on live stream. Nothing that wouldn't be torn apart in a 15-second TikTok clip the moment it left their lips. AOC sat still for a moment, letting the weight of her words stretch into the silence. Then she leaned into the mic one last time and said with absolute clarity, "You can write all the policy you want, but if it doesn't protect the people at the bottom, it's not policy, it's punishment." And just like that, her time was hers again. Not because it had been granted, but because she had taken it back. She had just finished describing what it meant for a woman to lose Medicaid coverage after a miscarriage, how it wasn't just the loss of care, but a second trauma layered over the first. Her words weren't dramatic. They were deliberate, measured, rooted in real stories from real constituents. The room had fallen into an uneasy stillness, but it didn't last long. From the far right side of the Republican bench, a quiet, unmistakable sound broke through the air. A smirk dragged into the open by a short, condescending laugh. It was soft, just a breath of mockery, but it cut sharper than any shouted objection. AOC stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes locked on the man who had let the smirk slip. He wasn't even trying to hide it. His mouth curled in amusement, head tilted slightly like someone too sure of his own detachment. He thought it was harmless. He thought no one would call it out. He was wrong. She turned her full attention to him. No yelling, no outrage, just silence, and then the kind of line that doesn't need volume to echo. "That smirk," she said slowly, "will be remembered longer than your vote." The man's expression changed just slightly. The smirk froze halfway. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The moment had already branded him. "You may think this is a performance," she continued, her gaze still fixed. "But for millions of women, this is not political theater. It's survival. And when you laugh, when you dismiss their pain with that expression, you're not just showing disrespect to me. You're showing it to every woman who's ever had to sit in a bathroom stall, bleeding and afraid, wondering if her state still considers her pregnancy active enough to deserve care." There was no sound in the room now, just the thrum of live microphones and the collective realization that she had seized control of the narrative again. She turned back to the full committee, widening her address. "Let's talk about states. You want to talk about responsibility? Let's look at where people rely on Medicaid the most. Mississippi, West Virginia, Louisiana, Arkansas, Alabama, Oklahoma, Kentucky. These are not progressive strongholds. These are Republican-led states, many of them represented in this very room, where upwards of 1 in 4 people depend on Medicaid." She let that number sink in. "So when you laugh, when you vote for these cuts, you're not punishing blue states or liberal policies. You're punishing your own constituents, the people who put you in office, the people who believe you when you say you're fighting for them." The smirking congressman had lowered his gaze now. The others on his side looked increasingly uncomfortable, but she didn't stop. Because that's the thing about smirks. They don't disappear. They linger. They get clipped, replayed, captioned. And trust me, when people see you laugh while I'm talking about miscarriage and Medicaid, They will not forget, neither will I. She didn't need to say another word. The smirk had done its damage, not to her but to the one who wore it. In a room full of rhetoric, it had revealed more than a dozen speeches ever could. And AOC, she kept going. Because her job wasn't to make them feel comfortable, it was to make them feel accountable. For a moment it seemed as though the room might retreat into silence again. The kind of silence that follows when truth has cut too deep and no one dares to reach for the bandages. AOC stood at the center, unwavering, the heat of confrontation still fresh in the air. She had called out the smirk, exposed the hypocrisy, and named the states. But even in the fire of her words, the visual remained unchanged. She stood alone, until she didn't. From the left side of the chamber, a voice rang out, not loud but strong. "Madam Chair, I'd like to yield time to the gentle lady from New York." All heads turned. It was a congresswoman from New Jersey standing now, her blazer a sharp navy, her presence calm but undeniable. She didn't grandstand. She simply nodded toward AOC and said, "Everything she said here today needed to be said, and more of us should have said it sooner." A small ripple moved through the room. Then, as if permission had finally been granted to stop pretending, another congresswoman stood. Then a third. They didn't speak all at once. They didn't gesture wildly or seek attention. They just rose, bodies aligned not by party, but by principle. Women who had heard enough behind the back muttering. Women who recognized that silence, too, is a kind of complicity. AOC turned slightly, catching the movement from the corner of her eye. The weight that had pressed against her shoulders for the past hour, the interruptions, the dismissals, the mockery, eased. Not because it had disappeared, but because it was no longer hers alone to carry. She didn't smile. There wasn't time for that. But her spine straightened a little more. Her voice, when she spoke again, carried something new. Not just resistance, but rhythm. "For every one of us standing here right now, there are hundreds of thousands of women watching from home," she said. "Women who've lost children and still been expected to show up for work the next day. Women who've held their breath in Medicaid offices, praying their paperwork went through. Women who've been told their grief was inconvenient to process." Behind her, the three congresswomen remained standing. The camera panned wider now, capturing not just AOC, but the unity behind her. There was no official resolution, no procedural rule to recognize what had just shifted. But it was undeniable. Truth, when spoken boldly enough, draws others toward it. Not because it's safe, but because it burns just hot enough to demand proximity. And in that moment, AOC was no longer a solitary voice cutting through the noise. She was flanked by fire, women who had chosen to stand not just in solidarity, but in defense of what was real, what was human, and what had been buried under too many layers of legislative indifference. "They say we're emotional," AOC said, letting the word roll slowly. "But emotion doesn't cloud judgment. It clarifies stakes. And the stakes in this bill are lives." No one interrupted her again. Not this time. Because even in a chamber built to resist disruption, they had finally realized this wasn't just one woman with a mic. This was a reckoning, backed by fire. The room had cooled again. Only this time, it wasn't discomfort or defensiveness filling the space. It was something heavier, quieter. Reflection, the kind that comes after someone says what everyone else was afraid to even admit they knew. The kind that lingers when the usual spin won't work anymore. AOC took a breath. Not out of exhaustion, but out of intention. She glanced toward the chair, toward her colleagues still seated, toward the stack of untouched paper that masqueraded as policy. And then slowly, she turned. She faced the camera directly. Not the room, not the committee, not the marble walls or the podium mic, but the lens, the small, silent eye beaming her words into thousands of homes, offices, hospital waiting rooms, and public libraries. And then she said it, clearly, intimately, as if she were in someone's living room. "Hello, I'm talking to you." The statement broke the fourth wall of the institution. For a moment, the Congress faded, and what remained was one voice reaching out across a distance in cynicism. "I want to tell you about a message I got last week," she continued. It was from a young woman in Alabama. She didn't preface it with a long story. She didn't send a political argument. She just asked one question: will I still have insulin next month? A pause, not dramatic, but real. She didn't ask for sympathy. She didn't even ask for help. She asked for certainty, because that's what she deserves. And the fact that she had to send that message to a stranger in Congress tells you everything you need to know about what this country has done to the people it claims to serve. The words weren't rehearsed. They didn't follow the arc of a floor speech or a stump statement. This was something else entirely, closer to confession than debate, but with steel underneath. She should never have to ask that question, AOC said. No one should, but especially not someone who did everything right, who followed the rules, who got the prescription, who found a way to afford the copay last time, and now just wants to know if she's going to survive next month. She turned slightly toward her colleagues as if to let them know this wasn't off topic. This was the topic. You want to talk about work requirements? About fraud prevention? About budget responsibility? Fine. But before any of that, answer her, look her in the eye through this camera, and tell her if she's going to have the insulin she needs to stay alive. There was no sound from the Republican benches, not even a cough, because the truth was, they didn't have an answer. The bill didn't have an answer. The architecture of bureaucracy they'd built was never designed to care about individual lives. It was designed to manage them, measure them, and move past them when they became inconvenient. She isn't a line item, AOC said, lowering her voice. She's a person, and if your legislation can't see that, then it's not fit to be law. Her eyes stayed on the camera, not blinking, not softening, just steady. Tonight, I'm not here to win a point. I'm here to keep a promise that someone, somewhere in this building, still remembers who we work for and still believes that healthcare isn't something you should have to beg for in a DM. She held the gaze a moment longer, then slowly turned back to the room. And without saying it, she'd already made it clear. This speech wasn't on the schedule, but it was the one the country needed most. She hadn't planned to say any of this. Not like this. Not without notes, not with the camera still locked on her face, not with the clock ticking down. But there are moments that call for truth over polish, for humanity over strategy. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez reached up, took off her glasses, and set them gently on the podium. No script, no buffer, just her voice and everything it carried. When I was a kid, she began, softer now, but not smaller, my mother worked 2 jobs, one cleaning houses during the day and another working nights at a diner just off the highway. There was no performance in her tone, just memory. She didn't have health insurance, not because she didn't want it, not because she didn't work hard enough. She didn't have it because both jobs were part-time, because the system was designed to extract her labor, but not protect her life. A silence crept over the chamber again, but it was different this time. It wasn't just discomfort, it was recognition. Even among those who disagreed with her, some knew a version of that story. They'd seen it in their own districts, maybe even in their own families, but few would ever speak it into the record. My mother got nosebleeds that wouldn't stop. She'd lie down on the floor at night because the headaches were so bad and she couldn't afford to go to the ER. She'd just say, "Mija, let me rest." And then she'd go to work the next morning like nothing happened. She looked around, not with accusation, but with unwavering clarity. "We didn't ask for handouts," she said. "We asked not to be invisible." It wasn't a line she'd rehearsed. It was a truth that had lived with her for years, quietly burning beneath every floor speech, every committee hearing, every policy proposal. And now it was out there, raw and unguarded. When I hear colleagues in this room talk about people gaming the system, I want to ask, what system do you think we're talking about? The one where a woman works full-time and still doesn't qualify for coverage? The one where a single mother misses a renewal deadline and suddenly her kid can't get asthma meds? She paused and let the question hang. Then, softer still, she added, "No one's gaming that system. They're just trying to survive it." Somewhere in the chamber, someone cleared their throat, another reflex of discomfort, a tick of defensiveness. But she didn't let it shake her. My mom used to say, they don't see us, Mija. They see what we clean, what we cook, what we hand them across the counter, but they don't see us. She looked up, and I told her one day I would make them see. That was the thread tying it all together. Not just her politics, but her purpose. Not just this debate, but her presence in the room at all. Every bill, every line, every vote meant nothing if the people most affected by them were never seen, never named, never heard. I'm not speaking tonight as a congresswoman, she said, her voice now steady again. I'm speaking as someone who's lived what too many people in this country still live every day. People who show up, who break their backs for jobs that break their spirit, and still get told they don't qualify for basic care. She glanced toward the stack of papers one more time, then turned back to the mic. You can debate the numbers, you can rearrange the budget lines, but you don't get to erase the people inside them. And in that moment, without script or statistics, AOC wasn't just debating a bill, she was refusing to let the people it harmed go unseen 1 second longer. Outside the chamber, the internet was no longer quiet. What began as a late-night committee hearing buried deep in C-SPAN's live stream had turned into something else entirely. Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, each one had lit up with clips, quotes, and screenshots. AOC standing alone at the podium. AOC naming the woman in Texas. AOC calling out the smirk. AOC speaking straight into the camera with no notes, no filter, and no fear. On Twitter, the hashtag she spoke for us began to trend in under 20 minutes. Thousands of users, nurses, grocery clerks, students, single parents, retweeted the line about LaTonya, the woman who worked too few hours to qualify for care. In one viral post, a young mother wrote, "She just told my story. No one's ever said it on the House floor before." On TikTok, a 15-second clip of AOC removing her glasses and saying, "We didn't ask for handouts. We asked not to be invisible," reached 1.4 million views in an hour. Someone had put soft piano music underneath it. Someone else had stitched it with tears in their eyes. Another simply wrote, "I've never cared about politics until now." Even on Facebook, where live political hearings rarely find traction, the stream had surpassed 250,000 concurrent viewers. That number only grew. And then there was the comment that cut through all the scrolling. "She's not talking to them. She's talking to us." It had 40,000 likes in 2 minutes. It wasn't just a compliment. It was a recognition of who the speech was really for and why it mattered. AOC hadn't spoken to the room because the room hadn't earned it. She had spoken beyond it, above it, and through it, to the millions whose lives were always discussed but never invited in. Back in the chamber, a staffer leaned down and whispered something into the ear of a Republican committee member. He glanced at the live feed on his phone, frowned, and quickly turned off the screen. But he'd seen enough to know the story had left the room. This wasn't just a floor speech anymore. It was a national moment. Later, when a reporter asked if she was just doing politics for the camera, AOC didn't hesitate. "No," she said plainly, "I'm just bringing the people into the room." Because that's what no one in power wanted to admit, that the problem wasn't that she was being performative. The problem was that she refused to perform for them. She performed for the woman in Alabama wondering about insulin, for the father in Arkansas who had to ration his heart medication, for the worker in Louisiana who got denied coverage because of a missed upload. She performed for the people they never imagined would be watching. And that's what made the room so nervous. Not her fire, not her facts, but the fact that this time, the nation was leaning in, and it wasn't looking away. The tide had clearly shifted. What was supposed to be a quiet vote in the shadows had become a national flashpoint. Outside the chamber, millions were watching. Inside, more and more members sat in tense silence, unsure whether to retreat, engage, or simply wait for the fire to burn out. But not everyone was ready to surrender the stage. That's when it came. A voice from the Republican side, measured, condescending, and clearly rehearsed, rose just loud enough to break the silence. "With all due respect," the congressman began, emphasizing the phrase like a shield, "this seems less like a policy discussion and more like someone auditioning for the cameras." The words were delivered with that casual cruelty DC does so well, dismissive, but not direct enough to violate decorum. It was a jab in a velvet glove, meant to undermine not what AOC said, but why she was saying it. The implication was clear. She wasn't here to legislate, only to posture, to build her brand, to go viral. A few chuckles followed from the Republican bench, low but intentional, the kind of smirks that weren't just about her. They were about every woman who's ever spoken with too much conviction in a room that preferred quiet compliance. AOC didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look surprised, because this was the script. This was always the script. Paint the passionate woman as performative, the outspoken Latina as theatrical, the truth teller as an opportunist. But instead of meeting condescension with outrage, she let the moment breathe. Then calmly, she leaned forward and asked, "When was the last time you looked a Medicaid recipient in the eyes?" The question hung there, heavier than any insult. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't list data points or rattle off headlines. She just let the silence that followed answer the question for her. "Because I do," she said quietly. "Every week, in my district, in grocery store parking lots, in crowded tenant meetings, in community clinics where the wait times are 4 hours long because they've been underfunded for decades." She turned toward the congressman who'd spoken, her voice still calm but unmistakably pointed. "I've seen mothers trying to choose between diapers and co-pays. I've talked to veterans who have to skip treatments because their coverage changed without notice. I've looked them in the eye and I've told them I would speak here on their behalf, even if this room wasn't ready to hear it." A pause, then she added, "Especially if this room wasn't ready to hear it." That line didn't need amplification. It struck clean, and it landed exactly where it needed to. Because the truth was, the smear didn't work. Not because it lacked venom, but because it lacked credibility. Everyone watching knew the difference between a performance and a plea, between ego and urgency. And no one watching believed for a second that the woman standing there, raw, unfiltered, and defiant, was doing this for show. "If you're uncomfortable with the attention," AOC said finally, "then maybe the problem isn't the camera. Maybe the problem is what the camera is finally exposing." No one responded, because what could they say? She wasn't here to be liked. She wasn't here to play the game. She was here to ask the one question they couldn't answer, because too many of them had forgotten how. And that, more than anything, was what made her dangerous. Not her words, not her presence, but her refusal to look away. The chamber eventually recessed, but the storm had only just begun. Outside the Capitol, the sky had turned the color of steel, and the crowd that had gathered since morning now stretched across the plaza. At first, it had been just a few protesters, quiet, holding signs about Medicaid, about justice, about survival. But as the hearing streamed, as clips of AOC's words spread like wildfire across the country, the numbers swelled. What began as a small gathering had grown into a movement by nightfall. They weren't chanting slogans crafted in political offices. They were speaking in grief. A woman from Ohio held up a poster with a picture of her son and the words, "He died waiting for coverage." A man in a wheelchair had a cardboard sign taped to his lap. "Do I need to lose a limb to be eligible now?" A group of nurses came straight from their shifts, scrubs still wrinkled, eyes tired but resolute. The people had come, not to disrupt, but to be seen. Because that's what this vote had always been about. Visibility. Who counts? Who doesn't? Inside the Capitol, AOC sat alone in her office. The lights were dim, not for effect, but because she hadn't touched the switch since she walked in. Her phone buzzed constantly on the desk beside her. Staff updates, press inquiries, notifications from social media. But she ignored all of them. What she was focused on wasn't trending. It was raw, unfiltered, and painfully real. She scrolled through video after video, message after message. A young mother from Georgia, eyes red from crying, recorded herself on her bathroom floor. "My daughter's EpiPen expired last week. I called the clinic. They said she's not covered anymore." A teenager from Arkansas typed a quiet caption under a video of his grandfather. "He has cancer. He doesn't know I'm recording. We haven't told him his Medicaid got denied." Another clip showed a woman standing in a hospital parking lot. "My mom had a seizure this morning. We didn't go in. We couldn't afford it." AOC didn't cry. Not because she didn't feel it. She felt every word, every pause, every moment where the voice cracked, but because crying would have felt like something she could do later. This wasn't a time for release. This was a time for reckoning. One message caught her off guard. It wasn't dramatic. It was one line, written by a man from Mississippi. "I saw what you said. Thank you. I thought nobody like you knew people like me existed." That's when she looked up from her screen. Because that was the point. This vote wasn't just about Medicaid. It was about erasure, about decades of policies that treated people like statistical noise, about rooms where decisions were made and voices were silenced. It was about a system that made pain feel normal and invisibility feel permanent. She took a breath and stood. This wasn't just about stopping a bill anymore. That part mattered, of course, but it was bigger than one vote. This was about refusing to let this pain remain hidden, about dragging it into the open, naming it, documenting it, and reminding those in power that every fiscal adjustment had a human name. Outside, the chants grew louder. Inside, she opened her notebook and wrote 6 words on the top of a clean page. "We are not numbers. We bleed." And with that, she began preparing for the next round. Because the fight didn't end when the floor emptied. It ended when the people no longer had to beg to be seen. After days of maneuvering, hours of testimony, and moments that would echo far beyond the chamber walls, the vote was about to begin. Members shuffled back to their seats, eyes fixed on the digital panels before them, posture rigid with the performance of routine. But the atmosphere was anything but normal. It was heavy, charged, as if the walls themselves understood that something far more permanent than a policy decision was being etched into the record. AOC rose from her seat for the final time that night. There was no paper in her hand, no binder, no formal script. She didn't need one. Everything that needed to be said had already been felt, by the country, by the people outside the building, and by every person who had sent their story to her inbox. But there was one final thing she had to say, because if history was going to record this moment, it had to be on her terms. She stepped to the mic and began, her voice low but steady. "Tonight, you don't just vote on a bill," she said. "You vote on who gets to survive." A pause followed, not silence for the sake of drama, but silence because the words hit too precisely, too simply, and too truthfully. Even the usual shuffling stopped. She didn't need to raise her voice. She had their attention, and she knew it. You vote on whether a child in rural Georgia gets her seizure medication next month. You vote on whether a grocery store clerk in Houston gets her insulin. You vote on whether a mother in Kentucky gets to recover from childbirth with dignity or with debt. She scanned the room slowly, making sure no one could look away. And no matter how you justify it, to your donors, to your party, to your own comfort when you go home tonight, know this: the people will remember. Not the language in the bill, not the footnotes or the friendly amendments. They will remember what side you stood on when it counted. Another beat passed. The chamber lights above her seemed to burn brighter, as if the system itself refused to dim this moment. Her voice stayed calm, but it carried an edge, an unmistakable finality. We will remember this vote, not because it was dramatic, but because it was deliberate, because it told millions of Americans, in the clearest terms, who this government believes is disposable. There was nothing left to add, no flourish, no call to civility, no pretense of unity where none existed. She stepped back from the mic, nodded once, and turned away. Her heels clicked softly against the floor as she walked back toward her seat, passing rows of members frozen in place, some looking down, others staring ahead, and a few, just a few, looking directly at her with something close to respect. She didn't look back, because the truth had already been spoken, and the vote that followed wouldn't erase it, it would only prove it. The final gavel came down at 3:11 a.m. It wasn't loud, but it echoed in every chest that had stayed awake through the storm. The tally lit up on the electronic board, 216 to 212. The bill had passed, just barely, by a thread, by the width of silence, by the power of exhaustion, and a well-timed maneuver. The chamber didn't erupt in cheers. There was no applause. just a strange, cold stillness. A kind of victory that didn't celebrate because even its winners knew what it cost. AOC sat still for a moment, staring at the numbers. Not out of shock, but out of clarity. She had seen this coming. From the moment the text of the bill had landed on her desk late Thursday, she knew what they were trying to sneak through. What kept her fighting wasn't naivety, it was duty. And that duty didn't disappear just because the vote didn't land in her favor. The energy in the room shifted. Some Republicans stood and began to gather their things, not with glee, but with practiced detachment. Others slipped out quietly, avoiding eye contact. A few Democrats looked to her, waiting, as if she were still at the podium, as if somehow she might still have something left to say that could reverse the clock. She rose slowly, her back stiff from hours on that narrow bench. Her team, a few aides, a few colleagues, had gathered nearby, solemn-faced but not broken. She didn't need to raise her voice. She simply turned to them and said, "We may have lost tonight, but we made them see us." That sentence hung in the air longer than the vote tally, because it was true. They had seen them, the people in the stories, the ones with cracked phones and expired insurance cards, the ones who had been erased from budget reports and policy white papers. For the first time in a long time, their names were spoken aloud in that chamber. Their stories made it into the record. Their pain was made visible. And visibility, as AOC had learned again and again, was the first step toward power. She walked toward the back of the room where the C-SPAN cameras had long since stopped streaming and paused at the exit. Outside, the hallway was lined with staffers and reporters, some silent, some teary, some still typing. One young staffer, she didn't know whose, leaned forward slightly and whispered, "Thank you." AOC met her eyes and nodded. No speech, no dramatic pause, just a glance that said, "I heard you, I'm not done." In the stairwell down to her office, she finally allowed herself a breath. It was deep and heavy, but not defeated. Her hands were still shaking, not from nerves but from the residue of adrenaline. Fighting for people you'll never meet does that to a person. It pulls something from you and gives something back. At the bottom of the stairs, she turned to her aide and asked, "How long do we have before the press conference?" 2 hours, they said. She smiled faintly. Good. Let's make sure they leave with the right headline. Because even when the vote was lost, the story didn't have to be. And if they thought this was the end, they were about to find out it was only the beginning. By sunrise, the chamber lights were off, but America was wide awake. Clips of AOC's speech, her quiet fury, her unwavering stare, her final walk off the House floor, lit up every corner of the internet. On YouTube, the video was already climbing to 1 million views. On Instagram, mothers were stitching her words over their own hospital bills. On TikTok, young organizers edited her quote, "You vote on who gets to survive," into short, sharp bursts that refused to be ignored. Even MSNBC ran a midnight replay, followed by morning anchors visibly shaken, reading aloud viewer emails that had flooded in within hours. And then came the hashtag reclaiming my care. It wasn't organized, it didn't need to be. It was instinct and raw, real, personal. From every state, people began posting photos of pill bottles they couldn't afford, videos of family members lost too soon, testimonies typed between shifts. Not political slogans, just human pleas. By 10 a.m., congressional offices were getting calls faster than their staff could log. Some callers were furious. Some were weeping. Some just wanted to know, is it too late to change the vote? In AOC's office, the phones rang nonstop. She stood near the window, watching a crowd begin to form outside the Capitol. No chants yet, no signs, just people showing up. She turned to her aide and said softly, "This isn't a trending moment, this is a reckoning." Because what had started as a bill vote had become something deeper. A line drawn, a curtain pulled back, a nation daring to demand that its care not be negotiated in silence ever again. And the story wasn't over. It was just starting to speak for itself. It was nearly evening when the envelope arrived. Handwritten, addressed in bright purple marker. No return address, just a sticker in the corner with a drawing of a sunflower and the words, "Keep blooming." Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. The handwriting was careful, with each letter drawn like it mattered. Dear Ms. Alexandria, my name is Lila. I'm 9. I watched you talk on the TV with my mommy. She cried a little and told me you are brave. I think you are too. I want to be loud like you someday. Love, Layla C. AOC read the note twice, her fingers still holding the edges like something sacred. Then she smiled, not the tight, polite smile she gave reporters, but the wide, unguarded one that reached her eyes. She turned toward her team, still buried in reports, emails, and incoming press requests. The office hummed with exhaustion, but also with the quiet pulse of momentum. They had lost a vote, but they had won something else. She lifted the letter slightly in the air and said, "Let's write the next bill." Heads turned. She added with a glint that was both fire and grace, but this time, during daylight. A few staffers laughed softly. One of them whispered, "Yes, please." And just like that, the mood in the room shifted. No longer reaction, no longer defense. This was the beginning of the next chapter. Because the story wasn't just about a lost vote or even a broken system. It was about the seed she had planted in Lila, in thousands of others. And those seeds, once spoken into the light, would grow louder than any vote ever could. This story isn't just about a vote, it's about visibility, about what happens when one voice refuses to dim in a room designed to silence. AOC didn't win that night on the floor, but she won something deeper. She made millions feel seen. She reminded us that policy is not paperwork, it's people. Behind every clause, every exemption, there are mothers, workers, children, and yes, little girls like Amelia, who now dare to dream louder. In a world often ruled by cynicism, moments like this plant seeds of belief, in truth, in accountability, in the power of showing up even when the odds are stacked. And you? Have you ever felt unseen in a room that should have heard you? What would you say if the mic were finally yours? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.